Welcome back to the Deep 404. Well, it has happened, the interview with Tucker Carlson sitting down with President Putin of Russia. It's an interview for the ages. I think one that many people in the West will probably fast forward through the first 30 minutes or so. But an interview that I think will be looked back upon as being historic, one in which President Putin takes the time to clearly lay out his position on Ukraine using references to 1,000 years of Russian history in order to do so. He sort of set the stage right from the start, going through Russian history, explaining how the lands covering areas of what's Russia today, what is Ukraine today, areas Poland and such, how they had changed hands, been under Russian control, moved around, but ultimately how he felt as though Russia, the nation of Russia, has a right to the lands, particularly to the Oblasts in Ukraine, to the east of the Dnieper River. So he made it very clear that this was a serious interview. A number of times he questioned Tucker at the start and said that, look, we've spoken about this. Is this going to be just a funny fluff piece, or is this going to be a serious interview? And Tucker had agreed it's a serious interview. And so Putin would then go off again, taking his time and reassuring Tucker that he was going to get to the point, and that he was building up to things. And what he was building up to there was just a solid foundation as to what his position is on why Russia is in the conflict and why they believe the eastern oblasts of Ukraine are actually Russian. Vladimir Putin appeared to be very knowledgeable. His recall of Russian history was very good. He did it with ease. He appeared calm, comfortable. He was confident in the interview. There were even some moments of fun between the two of them. Tucker did a good job. Tucker's a very affable, friendly person. He seemed interested in President Putin, in what he was saying, and wanted really to hear his answers and understand them. If you have seen some of Tucker's social media posts subsequent to this interview, you get the sense that he felt that President Putin was speaking to him truthfully, wasn't trying to deceive him, that what he was saying was what he really believed and felt, and I think a lot of it Tucker tended to agree with. He answered questions. He clarified points when Tucker was after clarification. He didn't avoid answering questions. He even got into very interesting details. He talked about how he felt that Russia had been treated and perceived by the West. Primarily, he spoke about the United States and France and Germany. Going back to Bucharest in 2008, when the announcement was made that Ukraine would join NATO, how he had outlined at that stage that this was not a good idea, not acceptable, and that the French and Germans, in agreeing to that then, were being led up the path by the United States. And he talked about the fact how he felt that the Russians and himself had been deceived over the Minsk agreements, with Angela Merkel coming out last year and stating that those Minsk agreements hadn't been honoured and they had been used to buy time for Ukraine. He spoke about Nord Stream and how he and Russia believed that they knew who was responsible for the Nord Stream pipeline destruction. I think everyone probably has a fair idea that it's most likely the United States behind this. President Putin indicated that he had information on this. He wouldn't reveal what the information was because he believed that would give away their source. But there's plenty of information out there indicating that the United States was behind this. They probably the biggest winner if that pipeline was destroyed. It would stop any likelihood of good relations between Germany and Russia continuing because of the pressure now placed on Germany not being able to receive the Russian gas. There is, of course, the video of Victoria Nuland before the pipeline had been destroyed, before the Russian special military operation had begun, and Victoria Nuland stating that one way or another, if Russia were to invade Ukraine one way or another, that pipeline would not proceed, hinting there that whatever it took, that pipeline would be stopped. So he talked about a number of those things. He talked about interestingly, how the Istanbul Accord, the negotiations that were going on in February, March and April of 2022, so just after the conflict had begun, the discussions with President Zelensky about finding a way to stop the conflict, how to find resolution. A couple of interesting points there. He mentioned that the Ukrainians were open to the discussions about the denazification of Ukraine, which has been an interesting topic which many people have spoken about, many claiming there's no right-wing Nazism in Ukraine, others claiming there are. A lot of even Western media press releases and articles prior to 2022 indicating a strong Nazi right-wing presence in Ukraine. But President Putin indicating that this was being discussed and that request to denazify Ukraine was being accepted and discussed by the Ukrainians. Also, that the Russian decision to pull back from Kiev, which occurred at that time, Russia had made it up to Kiev, the decision to pull back, it had been thought that this was done to alleviate pressure on the Ukrainians and as a bit of a deal, all right, we will pull back to help with negotiations. What President Putin has indicated here is that the request for this actually came not directly from the Ukrainians, but from the French and the Germans, from President Macron and Chancellor Scholz, that they were requesting that Ukraine couldn't negotiate with a gun to their head, and so that the Russians should pull back. And then President Putin explaining that this is where, again, he felt deceived by the West. Once that happened, he believes the Ukrainians then threw the negotiations out the window and effectively decided at that stage to embark upon a full and protracted war with Russia. This, of course, would have been around the time that Boris Johnson had reportedly visited Kiev and told President Zelensky not to sign any documents to negotiate any further, but instead to agree to let the US and NATO to support him, and that they would then together beat President Putin. So the outcomes of it, Russia is ready for peace, is how it seems. It seems how he presented his position. This has been a common point that has been mentioned by President Putin throughout the campaign, that Russia is ready to negotiate with the West. The negotiations need to occur with the right people. In this case, I think he's probably talking about the United States because they're behind the situation. He mentioned the fact that President Zelensky of Ukraine has signed a decree which won't allow Zelensky or Ukrainians to negotiate with Russia while President Putin is in charge. So again, demonstrating that it's the West, not him, that doesn't want negotiations. But that he does not trust the West, and that he has multiple times throughout his leadership been deceived by the West. NATO expansion, Minsk agreements, the Istanbul Accords, all of these examples that he gave. What would this mean for Ukraine? Likely, as we've been suggesting for some time, I don't think much has really changed here. When negotiations do happen, I think that Russia will still say that they wish to lay claim to the Eastern Oblasts east of the Dnieper. So the Dnieper will become a border. That river will become a border. Everything to the east and south of the Dnieper will become Russia. So that includes Kiev would become part of Russia. Kharkov, all of Kharkov, Zaporozhye region, Dnipropetrovsk, all of the eastern sides of that, and perhaps the cities themselves in their entirety will become part of Russia. While Odessa and Mykolaiv are not on the eastern side of the Dnieper, There, I could see there might be the possibility that President Putin would allow a negotiation for a controlled corridor of access for what remains of new Ukraine to be able to access Russian-controlled ports. I think there will be a strip along the coast which will become Russian, which will be, how far it reaches back, I don't know. Might be 50 kilometres, might be 100 kilometres. That will join up with Transnistria or Moldova, and we'll connect that through to Russian land, and will give Russia full control over the ports. But as I say, it may be negotiated that some Ukrainian access to those ports is provided under Russian control. Criticism online falls into a couple of groups. Criticism for Tucker Carlson, that he is a traitor, that he's a Russian asset, that he should be hung. This is coming from the anti-free speech, pro-Ukraine lobby, who just can't tolerate the thought of President Putin being able to speak and for that to be heard. All the ad hominem attacks, of course, likening Putin to Hitler, some sort of a monster, just rough, raw expletives being thrown out about him. These are criticisms, emotional criticisms, people who are just suffering cognitive dissonance, who have bought into one side of the narrative, are now, if they have taken the time to watch the video, perhaps struggling with the fact that he is cool, calm, he's not a monster, he's not outlandish, he's talking about peace, he's giving good reasons for why that hasn't occurred so far because of the activities of the West, explaining the history and his position very logically. Very difficult to, if you have built the narrative in your mind that he is some sort of a wild, crazed monster, to watch that video and still hold that idea that he's wild and crazed in your mind, because that causes cognitive dissonance. That just doesn't reflect the real Vladimir Putin in this interview. And then there's the deniers. The prime example is Admiral John Kirby, the White House spokesperson, who said, I'm paraphrasing, but don't believe a single word that Putin says, it'll all be lies. These are the people who are afraid of the fact that 130 or 150 million people are going to see this in the first few days. I'm not sure what the count is on Twitter already, but it will be up near that number at least. And this is the most anticipated video there has been in years. That those 150 million Westerners are going to watch this, and many of them are going to have that falsely created narrative in their mind begin to crumble. That narrative of Russia being the unprovoked aggressor in Ukraine, they're suddenly going to start questioning that. And if they start questioning that, particularly in the United States, they start questioning the current government, questioning Joe Biden. The mainstream media, moving out of social media, again, the expected sort of things there. Headlines that Putin is threatening the United States, which is the exact opposite of what he's talked about. He has questioned why the United States might want to get involved in this conflict, why they would want to send their troops to Ukraine. Surely they have better things to do. Don't they have problems at home they would be better off resolving rather than getting themselves and sending their young men to a conflict in Europe? Again, headlines that he's a deluded invader and shouldn't be listened to. And I feel like this sort of protesting too much is illustrative of the falsities in the Western narrative about not only President Putin, but the reasons that Russia got into this conflict. No acceptance in the West that NATO expansion eastwards, even after agreements, promises were given to Russia that this wouldn't happen, that it has continued to happen. No acceptance that has got anything to do with this. This is just a madman, an invader looking to consume all of Europe, and just starting with Ukraine are the headlines that are trying to dissuade people from taking the time to watch the video. As I say, already I think about 130, 150 million people on X have watched at least some of this interview. Of course, the full video is available on X, and also I read on the Kremlin website, they published it there as well. There were 2 translators involved. I believe President Putin's comprehension of English is quite good. I'm not sure how good his spoken English is. He chose to speak in Russian. But there were two interviewers there, two interpreters there, an American one brought by Tucker's team and a Russian one. And I've not heard that there has been any conflict or confusion between what was said. Everyone seems to be happy that what was said and what was translated is what was actually said. Now, President Biden yesterday had a 15-minute response, not a response directly to this, but he chose an unannounced briefing to be given, which was primarily in response to the special counsel's findings of his handling of sensitive and secretive documents. A number of documents were found in President Biden's garage, amongst other places. This interview for Joe Biden overall wasn't too bad of one for him. He didn't really lose it too badly. It wasn't great. None of his interviews these days are great anymore. He's lost the ability to deliver strong, forceful, believable messages. But this one, not too bad. He got most of the way through without demonstrating any major slip-ups or cognitive problems. There were two or three things. One was the gaffe he made where he was referring to the Egyptian president El-Sisi, but instead of referring to Egypt, he referred to Mexico, and then went on to aggrandize himself. There was him who convinced El-Sisi to open the border with Gaza, and he convinced Bibi Netanyahu to open the border. He did one of his wander-offs. He left, he wandered off the stage, packed up, wandered almost all the way out of the room, then seemed to mumble to himself, hostage negotiations, turned around, came back, talked again for a few moments, at which stage the reporters there began to really question him about the handling of the documents and the special prosecutor's statements on the handling of the documents. He shouldered no responsibility whatsoever. He laid all the blame at his staff, saying that, yes, he should have been more aware of what his staff were doing when they were taking all these sensitive documents and putting them in his garage. But he knew nothing about it and had no idea why those documents were being taken or placed in his garage, which didn't seem believable. He was constantly talking himself up, constantly referring to the fact that I've been found not guilty, that the most important thing to remember here is the special prosecutor decided not to prosecute me. It seemed like he was trying to convince people of his innocence. It wasn't a compelling statement. I didn't feel that I was believing him. It felt like he was trying hard to make me believe. He did appear feeble as he wandered off the stage. He then ultimately was questioned and had to address comments from the special prosecutors that, and again I'm paraphrasing here, but basically that, he could be found guilty. He shouldn't have had those documents there, but he's too feeble-minded to prosecute. Special prosecutor suggested that he couldn't recall when his son had died. He couldn't recall the period of time while he was vice president. Now, exactly what the statements were and what was said there, we're not given that information. What were the dates from which you were vice president and he couldn't remember and couldn't recall, or if he doesn't remember being vice president and instead thinks he's always been president, that wasn't clarified. In either case, those type of statements coming out from the special prosecutor, again, just add to the wealth of information about Biden losing his mental faculties. He was questioned on this by reporters, saying his memory was bad. He tried to make a sort of a joke as his anger began to rise, which fell flat. His response when he was questioned about his capabilities, he became angered. He started to raise his voice. He didn't maintain his composure and his calm and simply deflect and convince you or compel you to believe that I'm fine, I'm the man for the job, I've got no issues here. He gave the impression of someone struggling, trying to convince people that he was the right man for the job, but in reality, he's not. There is now on social media reports coming out, questions coming out about the possibility or the desire for a reciprocal interview where President Putin will be interviewed by a leading Russian reporter or interviewer. This won't happen. This won't happen because there is no way that President Biden could replicate a session like has just happened between Tucker Carlson and President Putin, where President Biden could sit down and look comfortable and confident for 2 hours discussing any questions thrown at him by the interviewer, be capable of reciting American history accurately. These sort of things President Biden's just not capable of doing anymore, and the result would be a farce. Okay, I'll leave that there. Just a bit of an update on what happened in that interview yesterday. I'll be back a little bit later on with an update on Ukraine and the Middle East.